Our last speaker is Paul Carver. Paul is currently an adjunct professor at Virginia Tech University, but Paul has spent more than a couple of decades up on Capitol Hill. He served a number of different roles for Congressman Obey from Wisconsin. Congressman Obey retired in 2010 as chairman of the Appropriations Committee, one of my heroes in Congress and a wonderful man and legislator. But Paul has served a lot of different roles, has a lot of experience. I have a feeling we're going to get a little bit of a history lesson right here that is going to be good timing as we lead into the questions.
Thank you for the opportunity to be here. In years past, I would have had boatloads of constituents coming by, giving me the opportunity to express my frustrations with what's going on. I haven't had that opportunity this year, so other than one occasion similar to this. So if I sound a little frustrated, don't take it personally. It's because I haven't had the opportunity to get my frustrations out. Yeah, I worked for Dave Obey for 28 years. From 1994 till the end of last year, he was the senior Democrat on the Appropriations Committee. I got to tell you, I don't have the faintest idea what's going to happen to the budget this year. We've heard the presentations about the budget process. That tells us, frankly, nothing about what's going to happen with this budget. We got the Bowles-Simpson Commission out there. They couldn't get the necessary votes to actually approve what they came up with. I understand Joe Biden's out there doing something. We got the gang of 5 or 6 in the Senate that are trying to pull something together. No one has any idea how we're going to get out of this situation right now. But that's not helping you very much. So let me try and say some things that might be helpful to you. And as Dave said, I'm going to try and give you a little political and historical context. Firstly, the deficit. There are 3 main reasons we're in the deficit hole we're in today. The first one is the Bush tax cuts. The second one are the Bush wars. And the third one is the Bush recession. You add all those up, and that's how we got to be here. Now, there was Politico, one of the Capitol Hill newspapers, carried a story a couple of days ago and it acknowledged Bush's responsibility for the deficit, but also said that Obama's tax and spending policies also were about equal. They are flat out wrong. Obama's spending that we undertook as part of the stimulus, for which my boss led the effort, was directly the responsibility of George Bush, because he put us in the recession hole, and we needed some Keynesian stimulus to try and get the economy moving again. And that stimulus was somewhat anemic for political reasons, because the White House didn't want a package that was more than $1 trillion, because they thought $1 trillion was politically unachievable. So we ended up in the House with a stimulus of about $900 billion. And then it went over to the Senate, and in order to get 3 Republican votes to give us the necessary margin to get it through, we had to cut it further. One of the interesting elements of that is one of the areas we cut was funding for pandemic flu, which was quite interesting when a few years later we had the H1N1 pandemic. And the senators from Maine, Susan Collins in particular, was seen backtracking feverishly from her previous statement saying how proud she was that she cut funding for the pandemic flu. In 2000, when George Bush was installed as president by the Supreme Court, we were looking at surpluses running more than $5 trillion over 10 years. Bush policies turned that around. Alan Greenspan at the time was running around fretting about the fact that we might pay off the accumulated debt for 200 years. Well, George Bush took care of that. We don't have to worry about paying off the debt anymore because we can't. So, despite the gusher in the Gulf last year, Despite the Democrats' successful efforts to restore the economy and jobs and clean up the mess that George Bush left behind with the help of the corrupt Republican Congress led by Tom DeLay, and despite the incremental gains we made last year in providing Americans with access to health care, and despite the attempts to bring sanity back to the financial industry and the real estate sector, the American people decided that they were going to sweep the Republicans into power in the House. And they did. So where does that leave us? Well, last year, the Democrats, still in control, we succeeded in passing exactly 0 of the 12 annual appropriations bills that we need to keep the government functioning. The main reason for that was that we lost Senator Ted Kennedy, who was our 60th vote in the Senate. And Senate rules provide that a determined minority is going to be able to thwart the will of the majority. That wasn't the only reason. Emboldened by the Tea Party yahoos in their demonstrations throughout last year, and sensing electoral blood, the Republicans in the House decided that they weren't going to participate in the electoral process. In the appropriations process. And they will insist that they weren't allowed to. The fact is they chose not to. And they decided that all they were going to do was throw political bombs, matters relating to abortion and gay marriage and whatever else they could grab their hands on, and try and attach these to these must-pass appropriations bills. And faced with that situation, Dave Obey, as chairman of the committee, decided, along with the Democratic leadership, that they were going to pull the bills and focus on what was going to be a very troubling electoral year. And they also knew that the Senate was a black hole, and if they passed any of those bills in the House, they weren't going to go anywhere in the Senate. So after the 2010 election swept the Republicans into power, we had a lame duck session with the Democrats still nominally in control. And what we witnessed was an abject surrender by the Obama administration and the Democratic Congress under enormous pressure from the triumphant GOP and the Tea Party. They agreed to extend the Bush tax cuts, guaranteeing enormous amounts of additional debt would be laid upon the American people, and ensuring that the conservative demands to eliminate and privatize the basic functions of the federal government would become irresistible. So today, where are we? In my view, we have a largely spineless blue dog administration. As I say, I think that's reflected in the Bowles choice to head this deficit commission. And along with Alan Simpson, who's shown his disdain for Social Security and for the beneficiaries of Social Security. And what they are confronting is a resurgent and ideological right that has more in common with the AntiFederalists of 1787 than it does to the grand old party of Abraham Lincoln and Teddy Roosevelt, Dwight Eisenhower, and even Richard Nixon. And frankly, even Ronald Reagan would be persona non grata in the Tea Party crowd that are running the House of Representatives these days. Ronald Reagan in 1982, when we were facing another recession, understood that we needed to raise taxes and provide some money for a jobs program to stimulate the economy. And so he worked with Tip O'Neill. They came up with a package that more than doubled the taxes that went into the Highway Trust Fund. So we got a middle-of-the-road Democratic president and a Democratic Party that's been cowed by the right-wing media and the 2010 bashing from the voters, and they're going to try and compromise with a party that was swept to power on a pledge of no compromise. The near-unanimous vote that the Republicans took on the budget resolution, Paul Ryan's budget resolution a few weeks ago, with its proposed annihilation of Medicare, should tell you all you need to know about the priorities of this Tea Party crowd. And it should tell you all you need to know about future funding for the programs that you care about. But when Dave asked me to participate today, I asked him for some basic information on the budgets, the funding that you folks would be seeking. Sent me a 23-page document, which, based upon my brief analysis a little earlier, laid out about 32 programs which were proposing to add $280 million to the funding levels. Well, I can tell you one thing, you are not going to get $280 million additional dollars for these programs. And I think there were 4 new initiatives perhaps in here, I wasn't quite sure, but they added up to another $170 million. Now the $170 million that you will not be getting. Back in 1787, Alexander Hamilton triumphed at the Constitutional Convention, and his vision of a strong central government with the power to tax and regulate commerce was written into the Constitution. A strong central government with the power to tax and regulate commerce was the reason we have the Constitution. You listen to the teabaggers, you listen to the Fox News pundits. What they're talking about are the Articles of Confederation. What we're seeing today and what we saw in 2010 and what we'll see in spades next year is the resurgence of the anti-federalist right, the vision of people like Grover Norquist, who said some years ago that he didn't want to destroy the federal government, he just wanted to reduce it to the size where it's small enough he could drag it to the bathtub and drown it. He's almost succeeded. This is the triumph of the Koch brothers. I'm sure you've heard of those folks. The Coors family, the Kohlers, the Scaife, the Bradleys, and other excessively wealthy families that are dominating American politics today. These folks take it as a personal affront, it appears, that average Americans might have access to health care and education without having to go into huge amounts of debt to get it. And they take it as an affront that folks should seek to impose taxes on their fortunes or regulations on their activities. Elections do matter. And as long as we're still a democracy, and somewhat barely, given the Supreme Court's recent decision on Citizens United that will give the corporations all the power they need to flood the airwaves. And as a personal aside, I think if we had Fox News in 1932, we would never have had the New Deal. But we're going to get pounded by these folks, and as long as we're still a democracy, we still have the power to do something about it. And if you see problems in Congress, you see problems in Washington, you need to look in the mirror, because that's where the problem lies, and that's where the solution to the problem lies. You need to educate yourselves about what's been going on for many decades now. This didn't just happen. I would be delighted to go on in great detail about the history of how we got here, but Dave's asked me to try and keep to 10 minutes. I would, before I finish, give you a little lobbying advice, because I know you're going to go up to the Hill. A few years ago, when Democrats were in the minority, and Tom DeLay was running the House, and going back to when the Republicans first regained control back in 1994, the appropriations process was viewed as an opportunity to stick their social engineering legislation on bills. One of the things they took particular delight in was putting anti-environmental riders on the appropriations bills. Things having to do with arsenic in the water and nasty emissions in the air. The Republicans, and Koch industry, one of the biggest supporters of this, deny that there's climate change and deny that we need to be taking steps to regulate these emissions. So they're doing their very best to eliminate our ability to do that. So the environmental community, in its infinite wisdom, decided that they need to get a campaign going at the grassroots level to convince Congress that we should block these environmental riders. Dave Obey, as the leading Democrat on the Appropriations Committee, was taking the lead in trying to block the riders and get the word out about the fact as to what these folks were doing and the consequences of what they were doing. The environmental community decided that it would be a great idea if they put calls into Obey's district to educate the concerned citizens as to these riders. The calls went in, they made it sound like Obey was the one that was responsible for putting these riders on the appropriations bills. And we started getting calls from our constituents asking us why we were imposing these anti-environmental riders on the appropriations bills. We called up the environmental group that was doing it, and we asked them to stop. In their arrogant and ignorant way, they decided that they'd teach us a lesson and they'd increase the number of calls that were going into our district. At that point, Obey decided that he was going to call the heads of all the environmental groups in Washington into his office and explain to them exactly what he thought of them. I have to tell you, I find dealing with the environmental community among the most frustrating experiences we have going. They too often look like the ideologues on the right. They're so convinced of the purity of their cause that they fail to understand the political context in which they have to operate. And as a final side, I just do not understand, after watching the Gusher in the Gulf for 4 months, what is it, spewing out more than 200 million gallons of oil into the Gulf, that the election was won by the party that just 2 weeks ago decided it was going to reverse the Obama moratorium and provide new incentives for further drilling in the Gulf. How is it that the environmental community failed to use the opportunity presented to them to make the case to the American people that there was a serious issue here that we needed to address? Instead, we got, 63 or thereabouts teabagger Republicans to come in and vote to repeal the regulations that we do have on the Gulf. So when you go to the Hill, please understand the context in which these decisions are being made. You have a Republican Party in the House that's dominated by the Tea Party conservatives. They have no interest in the federal government regulating or taxing anything. And I suspect if you go into some of those offices, if they're honest, they will tell that to your face. Thank you very much. Oh, if I could have one more comment. CQ is a great source of information. Use it. They charge about $2,000 to get the weekly magazine. But a couple of weeks ago, they had a picture of these gentlemen. Anyone know who these gentlemen are? This is Senator Graham and Senator Rudman. And back when we were fretting about the deficit about 20 years ago, they got together with Fritz Hollins and put together Graham-Rudman-Hollins, which was intended to put us on automatic pilot for spending. It was intended to provide a mechanism to require that Congress cut the deficit. I suspect that what you're going to find later this year is that Congress and this president are going to come to some new agreement on an automatic mechanism that will take the responsibility off their backs and give them an opportunity to go into the election next year and say, I didn't do it. It was whatever the equivalent of Graham-Rudman's going to be, maybe Erskine Bowles and Alan Simpson or Paul Ryan or something. Someone's going to put their name to the automatic mechanism, and it will be a fig leaf designed to avoid responsibility for the cuts that are coming to your programs. Thank you.
We'll open it up for questions. Let me just make one comment. I think the important thing, everybody's a little, I suspect, surprised. We don't hear speeches like this when we come to these kinds of conferences. The part that Paul said near the end that everybody really should focus on, the context of the political environment that we live in. I mean, forget some of the ideological, if you're not comfortable with the ideological piece of it, but recognize where the oceans are as a political priority for politicians. That's what I meant the other morning when we were launching this, and I said elections matter and voters matter. The Tea Party didn't create a 501c3 organization when they wanted to change the world. They went and won elections. Independent of how you feel about the Tea Party, recognize how they chose to win. So if we want to be successful, we have to live in the real world. And that's, unfortunately, a very uncomfortable thing for us to have to think about. Let's do some questions for everyone, please. If you would just introduce yourself and ask your question.
I'm Judith Bernstein. I'm with the Sierra Club, a local chapter, Santa Lucia chapter, which is formed in alliance with surf riders. Well, one of my questions was answered. It was, don't ask to double the budget of the line item that you are particularly interested in, because A, it won't happen, and B, as I understand it, it may take away from the overall purpose of this conference, which is promoting a broader ocean policy rather than specific little slices of it. I'm in the enviable position of seeing 3 very liberal, very pro-environmental senators and congresspeople tomorrow. I'm a little bit concerned that they know that they still have a strong constituency, that 2012 isn't going to be their downfall. Feinstein and Boxer and then Lois Capps, that it's not going to be their downfall if they continue to take the strong environmental stands they have. And thanks to, I'm sorry I forgot your name, blue shirt person?
Yeah, Jeremy.
I like your idea of tying it into a broader issue, because marine sanctuary preservation in one area is not a broader issue. But it seems that all the issues that are out there are a no-no, because the energy policy failed dismally. Job creation, there's still a lot of debate whether we had a net gain in jobs or not at all. I'm not sure what a strategic, broader policy area to tie it in would be, and I'd like a few suggestions from you on that.
Yeah, I can add a couple comments. I guess one way to look at it in terms of the broader sense is, if you look at the CR that was passed, the only budget items that went out for NOAA were the 2 lines that Emily was talking about before, ORF and PAC, or the operations and the acquisition account. There wasn't any subsets in there. So even just championing a higher NOAA number is good. If NOAA helps your particular program, maybe it's EPA, maybe it's Department of Interior. And another thing that's worth noting is that Senator Inouye put out an earmark moratorium for FY11, FY12. And that may actually be very beneficial for a lot of your groups, because one thing that we have tried to do on the Senate Appropriations side, at least in Commerce, Justice, Science, is expand the competitive pots of money so that it reduces the amount of earmarks, but then also gives OMB a chance to support some of the items in there that Congress supports. So if you can look at those items, these competitive pots of money, whether if it's, if I'm thinking about the Sierra Club, if it's like open rivers or community-based restoration or coastal zone management, whatever those hooks are, these external fundings, that's something that your senators can champion. And even though earmarks are out, dear colleague letters are in, meaning these are when senators can group together and support national programs, and it does give them a voice, because we do listen to those every year. I mean, we stack them up, and that's what we point to for helping to make decisions on the committee.
Good. Next question.
Hi, my name is Scott, and I'm a taxpayer. Actually, my name is Scott Scheckman. I'm with the Ocean Defenders Alliance out in Southern California. I want to thank the panel for your time. Paul, you shouldn't sugarcoat it. You should tell us how you really feel about things. I mean, seriously. I was listening to Paul's talk, and I appreciate the other panelists as well. I think maybe I speak for some others where, if you are paying attention to the news, you go, well, what is going on? And, you know, you hear about a $14 trillion deficit that they're willing to talk to you about, and I hear it's much higher if you start talking about other things and obligations. But that said, if we're in some kind of new paradigm that's different from the way we were doing business in the 80s and 90s, and you know, my time of growing up, where environment was actually taken a little bit more seriously, I think, by the federal government and state governments. What can we do to resolve our differences, perhaps, get away from business as usual if it's not going to work anymore? Stop trying to live in a fantasy of what, you know, used to work, any way of budgeting things, and I actually have to budget my own group this way as well. But how do we move on from here and get to the next paradigm and start spending money wisely on what we all feel is important, that's healthy for all of us, so it's all win-win, and perhaps just declare some other kind of winner and loser situation so that we don't drag this on for eternity? I was just wondering if the panel could respond to that.
Paul, go first if you would.
We're not going to resolve our differences. Back in 1934, the DuPont brothers, in response to the first stirrings of the New Deal, set up the American Liberty League. They did it in a way to hide the fact that it was funded by big business. They didn't appeal to the American people by saying that they wanted bigger profits and lower taxes and fewer regulations. They couched it in the form of the Constitution and freedom. They've been doing that for 70, 80 years now, and they've become very good at it. They will continue to do that because fundamentally they don't believe the federal government should be doing any of these things. They don't believe in Social Security. They don't believe in Medicare, let alone any of the things that you care about. They don't believe we have any business doing this. So you're not going to resolve your differences. As I said, Obama went out of his way to appeal to the House Republicans when he was first elected, and they turned their nose up at it. We ended up having to pass the budgets with no Republican support whatsoever. What you're going to have to do is win the argument. If you believe that the federal government has a responsibility here in cleaning up the oceans or anything else, you're going to have to make the case to the American people, and I would start, as I tried to emphasize, with Alexander Hamilton and the Constitution, which was intended to set up a system where we could tax and regulate commerce. And frankly, we've entirely lost sight of that. As far as paying attention to the news, the University of Maryland, back, it was either just before we invaded Iraq or shortly after, I think it was shortly after, tested the 3 myths of 9/11, that it was Saddam Hussein that did it, that Saddam Hussein had links to Al-Qaeda, and that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction. They found out that people who got most of their news from Fox, 85% of them believed all 3. People got their news from CBS, 65% of them believed all 3. You watch the network news, you are dumber after you watched it than before. You have to find better ways to get your news, because you're not going to get it from network television. I'm not sure I've answered your question, but I've tried as best I could.
Anyone else do you want to add anything? How we move on to a new paradigm? We'll do another question. We'll come see how that comes back around.
Good afternoon. My name is Marcelo Gutierrez. I am a conservationist and a politics blogger. Dave keeps talking about how elections matter. And as we go up to the next election, we hear that the Latino vote is going to be the deciding factor. Whomever wins is going to have the 40% of the Latino vote. I don't have the name of the study off the top of my head right now, but there was a study this year that came out that said the Latinos were the single voting bloc that was self-identified most willing to tax themselves on behalf of conservation. A, are you any of you aware of that? And B, what are you going to do to take advantage of that?
Yeah, let's look around how many Hispanics were in this room. We have
How
struggled.
many people of color in general?
We have struggled mightily with minorities in the ocean conservation movement. You look at ocean science, some of the similar things. There are a number of groups that have actually taken, I think, very strong actions to start to engage some of these communities, more along the social justice side of environmentalism, but some with oceans as well. I live in Central California, and Salinas is the largest city close by. Salinas is only a few dozen miles from the ocean, but the majority of the young children there have never been to the ocean. The Monterey Bay Aquarium, for example, takes on a number of initiatives to try to deal with education and outreach. I am sure there are many people here who could share stories of their own groups, the large environmental groups and others. I think you raise a very important issue. I think I don't see how well, the presidential election is certainly going to be, it's going to be a very important part of it, but we're also seeing it in a number of districts. Look at Texas. For example, there's the Democratic nominee in Texas is a Hispanic man, the highest ranking military officer of any Hispanic in the United States, actually. And so I think we're going to see on the right and the left a real push and pull for this constituency. But what are their core values? Their core values indeed align, from the data I've seen, with things we care about, both on the conservation side, but the social justice side as well. So any of the panelists have anything?
Well, my own comment on that is, I think Latinos are pretty much like all other Americans. They care about jobs, they care about earning enough money to pay the rent or the mortgage. And I think, like most Americans, they're divided. I think you have your Christian right among Latinos. I think you have your conservative business group among Latinos. To the degree that Latinos are a lower income demographic than perhaps some other populations, one would hope, I would hope, that they would be more inclined to vote Democratic. But I think you're right. I think Latinos will grow and continue to be an enormous influence on the election. But I'm not sure that appealing to them necessarily as Latinos is going to make any difference. I think what's going to make a difference is appealing to the American people in terms of jobs, education, healthcare, and those matters, and I think they apply as much to Latinos as everybody else.
Next question.
Thank you for your presentations. And you know, this weekend has been a very enlightening experience for me. And so therefore now my question is to all the panelists and this room, I guess, and I want to piggyback on what my sister just said here, because I've not really heard social justice mentioned at all, except for people like ourselves who have come up there to this mic constantly. And so what I want to know is, given the nature of the political climate, that we all know the issue, the nature of the budget, and let's take out of this conversation the discourse of the need for jobs and education. How is it that we look at an oceans policy that will address, and the budget that will address vulnerable populations and vulnerable pieces of the oceans, if you will, that will be taken care of from a justice perspective? I have great admiration for Senator Mikulski, and she's done great work for the Chesapeake. But how is it that we are able to mitigate the impacts on the Gulf, as you indicated, through the budget lens, by being able to provide for a restoration process across the United States that will help lift people up, not keep people in further harm's way, but be able, and I'm not talking about giving people handouts. I'm talking about people who have been living sustainably. I agree with your point about the environmentalists. And I'm asking also about the oceans, folks, because we need to work together. And so my question is, how is it that we work together to force this budget? Because I am disturbed right now. I can't see any of us winning based on the complexion of this room. And having be able to really get a budget. I mean, even what you need for your surfboard, you're not going to get. It's my understanding. So if the surfers can't surf, how is it that historic African-American fishermen and oystermen and these folks make sure they maintain their leases and get their payments from BP that they're supposed to get? How is the budget, I'm sorry I'm going a long way around this, but how does the appropriations and the president's budget allot for situations like that?
Emily?
Thank you for raising that issue. I think one of the regions where we've seen the connection between ocean and coastal conservation and the health of ocean and coastal ecosystems and the health of communities really was in the Gulf of Mexico with the impacts of the BP oil spill. And so I think, and I think the social justice piece of the conversation is very much part of the conversation going forward about how to restore the Gulf of Mexico. Probably not to the extent that it perhaps needs to be, but it's certainly there. And I think, you know, with all the discussion of the sort of macro level politics and all the different issues that people are particularly interested in, you know, it all comes back to what are people's priorities and what are their motivations. And so I'm encouraged, I'm excited that that the day tomorrow is really focused on mobilizing the folks that are here, building on the momentum of the folks that are here to bring them to the Hill to be expressing to the members of Congress what people are interested in, what they care about, and what their priorities are. I mean, you know, for all the macro politics, for how screwed up all the processes are, and the budget situation, the fiscal reality, you know, certainly there are elements of environmental issues that maybe are not being advanced as much as they could. For all of that, at sort of the overarching infrastructure here, at the base level, what we need to continue to do, regardless of what the issue is to make sure that the communities that care about the oceans, the communities that care about the coast, the communities that care about the environment are expressing that priority and that interest to their members of Congress. And I think that that's the focus of tomorrow. So I think you know, tomorrow is a good step towards moving that forward.
Jeremy, you want to add anything onto that?
I can just add something real quick to that, because it's, you know, one thing that you had highlighted is, you know, how in this big process, you know, how is it that we can actually get a voice in a timely manner to actually get some results? And as we all have outlined the different processes and how it impacts everything, you know, one advantage that you do have with tomorrow to talk to your representatives and your senators is that, you know, with the budget cycle, there is that opportunity. Every year we do have to get a budget out. It's one of the few bills out there that we have to do every year. And in order to do that, we have to compromise. So it's four corners. It's just on the CJS side of things, it's Senator Mikulski, it's Senator Kay Bailey Hutchison from Texas, the majority and the minority, and then on our House side, it's Representative Wolf, Chairman Wolf, and Ranking Member Fatsa. So the four members, they have to get together and agree on a bill and get it out the door, and they have to get it out on time. Now, granted, that time slips, but they do have to get together and agree. It's at times like that that members realize that it's a give and take, and it's when those priorities come in that they hear from all the other sides to be able to lift in. And we see that with the supplementals that come in, where they're able to help out with the Gulf. And we do see that creep in at the last minute every year. There's always something that holds open the conference to get something in to help out a certain member or a certain district. And usually those things that get plugged in, the only ones that do get plugged in are the ones that directly help individuals or communities. And that's important because sometimes that isn't necessarily recognized in our whole process, and those don't come to light. That being said, the way the process is, it doesn't make it easy for everybody's need and everybody's idea to be able to get in a timely manner. So all I can really say is to continue to get that message heard, get it packaged the right way, and continue to tell the right folks. And there's going to be plenty of ears out there listening.
Any other questions? If not, we will end it. Thank you, Emily, Jeremy, Paul. Thank you, guys. Thank you all, and I think we're going to start up in just a couple of minutes for prep for tomorrow's Hill Day.